That dress looks like something from a thrift store. The wealthy teenager sneered at the black maid's handmade creation, her cruel laughter echoing through the marble mansion. But when a legendary fashion designer saw those same sketches, he called them masterpieces that surpassed anything from the world's top design schools. Watch as public humiliation transforms into sweet vindication when the woman they mocked as trash bag couture receives a personal invitation to join New York's most exclusive fashion house. The same internship that rejected the spoiled daughter who had tormented her. This is the story of how discarded fabric scraps became runway gold, how cruelty backfired spectacularly, and why you should never underestimate someone just because they're wearing a uniform. Stay until the end to witness the most elegant revenge in fashion history and discover how true talent always finds a way to shine, no matter how hard people try to dim its light. That dress looks like something from a thrift store. The wealthy teenager sneered as she pointed at the black maid's handmade creation, her laughter echoing through the marble halls. What she didn't know was that she had just insulted a future fashion legend whose talent would soon silence every cruel voice in that mansion. The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore estate cast golden light across faces that had never known struggle, never questioned privilege, and certainly never imagined that genius could walk among them wearing a servant's uniform. Tonight, the mansion buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes when society's elite gather to celebrate their own importance. Designer gowns worth more than most people's yearly salaries swept across imported marble floors, while champagne that cost more per bottle than minimum wage workers earned in a week flowed freely from silver trays. Into this world of manufactured perfection stepped Imani Williams, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to glow against the cold opulence surrounding her. At 23, she moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling champagne flutes and clearing empty plates with the invisible efficiency that the wealthy demanded from their help. But tonight was different. Tonight, instead of her usual black uniform, Imani wore something that made several guests do double takes. The dress was simple in its construction but breathtaking in its execution. Cut from deep emerald fabric that caught the light like captured starlight, it featured delicate hand-stitched details that spoke of hours of careful work and an eye for beauty that couldn't be taught in any design school. The silhouette was classic, yet modern, elegant yet accessible, the kind of piece that whispered rather than shouted its sophistication. But to Madison Whitmore and her circle of privileged friends, sophistication could only come with a designer label and a price tag that excluded 99% of the population. At 17, Madison had never worn anything that wasn't crafted in the ateliers of Paris or Milan, never owned a piece that didn't bear the signature of a famous house, never considered that beauty might emerge from anywhere but the approved channels of high fashion. "Oh my God, look at what the help is wearing," Madison whispered to her friend Sophia, her voice carrying just loud enough to ensure maximum humiliation. The laughter that followed was the kind of sound that revealed the ugliness beneath beautiful faces, sharp, cutting, designed to wound. "Is that from the thrift store clearance rack?" Sophia joined in, her voice dripping with the casual cruelty that comes from never having been denied anything in life. "It looks like she made it herself from curtain fabric." The other girls giggled like a pack of hyenas who had cornered their prey. To them, Imani wasn't a person with feelings, dreams, or talents worthy of respect. She was just part of the scenery, existing only to serve their needs and absorb their contempt when they needed someone to feel superior to. But what these spoiled children didn't understand was that they were staring at a work of art created by hands that understood fabric like a musician understands notes, by a mind that saw possibilities where others saw scraps, by a heart that refused to let circumstances define the limits of beauty. Imani had stitched that dress by candlelight in her tiny room, using techniques passed down through generations of women who had learned to create magic from nothing. As their laughter echoed through the mansion, Imani's face remained composed, her dignity intact despite the assault on her pride. She continued her work with grace, but something flickered in her dark eyes, not anger, not hurt, but the quiet determination of someone who knew her worth regardless of what others chose to see. The wealthy family thought they were laughing at a simple maid in a homemade dress. They had no idea they had just mocked someone whose talent would soon make headlines, whose designs would grace runways, and whose story would prove that true artistry recognizes no boundaries of class or color. If you've ever been underestimated because of your background, your job, or how you look, this story is for you. Hit that like button if you believe talent deserves recognition regardless of where it comes from. Drop a comment sharing a time when someone surprised you with their hidden gifts. And subscribe, because stories like this, stories that celebrate the extraordinary people the world overlooks, are exactly what we need to see more of. Don't let this message of hope and validation stop with you. But what those cruel teenagers didn't know was that the woman they had just humiliated carried within her hands a gift so extraordinary that it would soon make their designer labels look like cheap imitations. Hours after the laughter had faded, and the last champagne glass had been cleared, Imani sat alone in her small room above the mansion's garage, the moonlight streaming through a single window as she worked by the warm glow of candlelight. This was her sanctuary. Her secret world, where the cruel words of entitled teenagers couldn't reach her, where her true self emerged from beneath the invisible uniform of servitude. Spread across her small wooden table were sketches that would have made fashion editors weep, with envy-flowing gowns that seemed to dance on paper, structured jackets that challenged every rule of traditional tailoring, evening wear that somehow managed to be both timeless and revolutionary. But these weren't just drawings born from imagination. They were blueprints for a future that Imani could see with crystal clarity, even if the rest of the world remained blind to her vision. Her fingers moved across the fabric with the reverence of a pianist touching keys, each stitch a note in a symphony that only she could hear. The dress she was creating, Tani their third this month, told a story of transformation, of finding beauty in the discarded and forgotten. The deep purple silk had been destined for the mansion's trash after Mrs. Whitmore declared it hopelessly outdated, following a single wearing. But in Imani's hands, it was being reborn as something far more beautiful than its original incarnation. This was the legacy her mother had left her, not money or property or social connections, but something infinitely more valuable. Memories flooded back of Saturday afternoons in their tiny apartment in Atlanta, where Mama would spread fabric across the kitchen table and teach her daughter that every piece of cloth had a soul, every design had a purpose, every stitch carried the dreams of the woman who made it. "Baby girl," her mother's voice seemed to whisper through the candlelit silence. "Your hands were made to create beauty, not just for rich folks who can afford to buy it, but for everyone who deserves to feel beautiful." Mama had been a seamstress her entire life, working for families who paid her barely enough to survive while wearing the masterpieces she created to events where she would never be welcome as a guest. The irony wasn't lost on Imani as she worked with the Whitmore family's cast-offs. Every discarded scrap, every ruined piece of designer fabric, every remnant deemed worthless by people who measured value only in price tags, became raw material for her rebellion against a system that said beauty belonged only to those who could afford to purchase it from approved sources. Tonight's creation was different, though. As her needle moved through the silk with practiced precision, Imani felt something shift in her approach. The dress wasn't just another piece for her growing collection, it was a statement. A declaration that artistry couldn't be contained by circumstances or suppressed by cruelty. Each carefully placed pleat seemed to absorb the humiliation from earlier, transforming it into fuel for something magnificent. By dawn, the dress would be finished, hanging in her tiny closet alongside the other pieces that represented her true identity. But Imani didn't know that fate was already setting events in motion that would soon pull her creations from the shadows into the light, or that the very people who mocked her tonight would soon discover that they had insulted someone whose talent would make headlines around the world. As she worked through the night, transforming discarded luxury into timeless art, Imani Williams was unknowingly stitching together the threads of a destiny that would prove genius recognizes no boundaries of race, class, or circumstance. The invisible maid was about to become impossible to ignore. But fate has a way of placing the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment, and what happened next would prove that sometimes a child's innocent curiosity can change everything. The next afternoon, while Imani was polishing silver in the mansion's vast dining room, 10-year-old Luca Whitmore wandered into the servant quarters with the fearless exploration that only children possess. Unlike his older sister Madison, who had inherited their mother's capacity for cruelty, Luca carried his father's genuine curiosity about the world beyond their gilded walls. He found Imani in the small sewing alcove she had created near the laundry room, her latest sketches spread across an ironing board that doubled as her design table. The afternoon light streaming through the narrow window illuminated her work like a spotlight on hidden treasure, and Luca's young eyes widened with the kind of wonder that adults had long forgotten how to feel. "What are those?" he asked, his voice filled with the innocent fascination that makes children such powerful observers of truth. He wasn't seeing a maid's hobby or a servant's presumptuous attempt at art, was seeing beauty, pure and simple, the way children see the world before society teaches them what they're supposed to value. Imani looked up, startled by the intrusion but touched by the genuine interest in the boy's expression. "Just some drawings, sweetheart. Nothing important." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. These sketches were the most important things in her world, the visual manifestation of dreams that refused to be contained by circumstance. "They look like princess dresses," Luca said, leaning closer to examine the flowing lines and intricate details that seemed to dance across the paper. "But prettier than the ones in my sister's magazines. These look like they have stories." The observation hit Imani like a lightning bolt. This child, who had been surrounded by luxury his entire life, who had access to every designer magazine and fashion show in the world, had immediately recognized something that the adults in his family couldn't see, that her designs carried emotional weight, narrative depth, the kind of soul that mass-produced fashion could never possess. "Would you like to see more?" Imani heard herself asking, surprised by her own boldness. Something about Luca's genuine enthusiasm made her forget the invisible barriers that usually kept her hidden in the shadows. For the next hour, she showed him sketch after sketch, explaining how each design told a different story, how the choice of fabric could convey emotion, how the cut of a dress could make a woman feel powerful or peaceful or playful. Luca listened with the intense concentration that children bring to subjects that truly capture their imagination, asking questions that revealed an intuitive understanding of artistry that many adults never develop. What neither of them realized was that Luca's godmother, Elena Marchetti, had arrived early for dinner and was searching for her godson throughout the mansion. Elena, a retired fashion editor who had spent 3 decades discovering and nurturing talent for Vogue, followed the sound of animated conversation to its source. When she appeared in the doorway and saw the sketches spread across the makeshift design table, her breath caught in her throat. 40 years in the fashion industry had taught her to recognize genius when she saw it, and what she was looking at transcended anything she had seen in recent memory. "Luca, darling," she said quietly, her voice barely concealing her excitement, "who created these beautiful designs?" The boy turned with a bright smile, completely unaware that he was about to set in motion a chain of events that would transform Imani's life forever. "This is Imani. She makes the most amazing dresses, and she told me stories about every single one." Elena Marchetti stared at the sketches, then at the young woman beside them, and felt her heart skip a beat as she realized she had just discovered something extraordinary. But what Elena discovered that afternoon would soon be overshadowed by something far more sinister, a moment of public cruelty, so devastating that it would test whether talent could survive the systematic destruction of human dignity. The following evening, the Whitmore estate transformed into something resembling a runway show crossed with a garden party, as Mrs. Victoria Whitmore hosted her annual fashion-forward charity event. The irony of raising money for underprivileged children while treating her own staff as invisible was lost on everyone except Imani, who moved through the crowd serving canapés while surrounded by conversations about giving back and social responsibility. Elena Marchetti watched the proceedings with growing unease, her trained eye catching the subtle dynamics of power and prejudice that played out beneath the veneer of charitable sophistication. She had spent the previous day thinking about Imani's sketches, making discreet inquiries about the young woman's background, and formulating a plan that could change everything. But first, she needed to witness how this family truly treated the person whose talent had left her speechless. Madison Whitmore held court near the fountain, resplendent in a custom Valentino gown that cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by her usual circle of equally privileged friends who treated social events like opportunities to practice their cruelty on safe targets. The champagne had been flowing freely, loosening tongues and amplifying the inherent nastiness that luxury often breeds in those who mistake wealth for worth. "Mother, why do we even allow the help to dress up during events?" Madison's voice carried across the garden with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been denied anything. "It's so embarrassing when they try to look presentable." Mrs. Whitmore laughed, the sound sharp and cutting in the evening air. "Darling, we can't expect them to understand appropriateness. They see our beautiful things and think they can simply replicate the elegance." The conversation might have remained at this level of general condescension, but then Imani appeared, carrying a tray of fresh champagne flutes, wearing a different dress than the one that had sparked Mockery the night before. This creation was even more stunning, a midnight blue piece that seemed to capture starlight in its fabric, with subtle beading that caught the garden lights like scattered diamonds. The sight of it stopped Madison mid-sentence, her face contorting with the kind of rage that beautiful people feel when confronted with beauty they cannot own, cannot purchase, cannot control. "Oh my God," Madison's voice rose to a pitch that made nearby conversations pause. "Did you see what the maid is wearing now? She actually thinks she's a fashion designer." The laughter that followed was louder and more vicious than the night before, designed not just to amuse but to wound, to publicly humiliate, to put someone back in their assigned place. "Maybe she's planning to start her own line," Sophia chimed in, her voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Trash bag couture, or perhaps clearance rack chic." The group erupted in the kind of laughter that reveals the emptiness behind expensive educations and designer gowns. But Madison wasn't finished. Emboldened by the audience and the champagne, she raised her voice to ensure maximum humiliation. "Seriously though, maybe you should consider modeling for discount stores someday, where people shop when they can't afford real fashion. I'm sure there's a market for whatever this is supposed to be." The cruelty was so breathtaking, so publicly devastating, that even some of the other guests looked uncomfortable. Imani stood frozen in the center of the garden, her tray trembling slightly in her hands as every eye turned toward her. The dress that represented hours of careful work, that carried her mother's legacy in every stitch, that embodied her dreams of something beyond servitude, had become the target of systematic destruction designed to crush her spirit entirely. Elena Marchetti watched this display of casual sadism with growing fury, her decades in the fashion industry having taught her to recognize both genius and the kind of insecurity that drives people to destroy what they cannot understand. She saw Imani's face, the careful composure that barely contained the pain, the dignity that refused to break even under this assault, the quiet strength that transformed humiliation into fuel for something greater. What the laughing crowd didn't notice was how Imani's response revealed her true character. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't stoop to their level of petty cruelty. Instead, she simply nodded with a grace that made their behavior look even more pathetic by comparison, gathered her tray, and walked away with her head held high. But Elena noticed. She saw the tears that Imani refused to let fall, the way her hand shook as she disappeared into the mansion. the courage it took to maintain dignity while being publicly torn apart by people who mistook cruelty for cleverness. In that moment, Elena made a decision that would change everything. As the laughter continued behind her, Elena followed Imani into the mansion, her mind already composing the phone call she would make that very night. She had just witnessed the kind of injustice that her industry connections could address, and she intended to use every relationship she had built over 4 decades to ensure that talent would triumph over prejudice. The spoiled children in the garden thought they had won, thought they had successfully put someone back in their place. They had no idea that their cruelty had just awakened the attention of someone with the power to transform Imani's life forever. Madison Whitmore had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life, and she was about to discover that sometimes the people you humiliate turn out to be the ones the world has been waiting to celebrate. If you believe talent deserves recognition regardless of background, hit that like button, share your own story of overcoming prejudice in the comments, and subscribe, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice and prove that true artistry can never be silenced by small minds. But what happened at midnight that very same night would prove that sometimes angels wear the faces of retired fashion editors, and justice comes through phone calls that change everything. While Imani lay awake in her small room, still feeling the sting of public humiliation, Elena Marchetti sat in her hotel suite with her phone in one hand and Imani's sketches spread across her mahogany desk. The images she had secretly photographed that afternoon glowed on her laptop screen like captured lightning, each design more breathtaking than the last. But Elena wasn't just looking at pretty picturesque, she was seeing the future of fashion, and she knew exactly who needed to see it. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, groggy but alert. "Elena, do you have any idea what time it is?" "Marcus, I need you to sit down and open your email right now," Elena said, her voice vibrating with the kind of excitement that comes from discovering buried treasure. "I'm sending you something that's going to change your perspective on everything." Marcus Robinson, the legendary black fashion designer whose name graced billboards from New York to Paris, had known Elena for 20 years. He had learned to trust her instincts completely, especially when she used that particular tone of voice, the one that meant she had found something extraordinary. "Elena, I have a show in Milan next week, 3 investor meetings tomorrow, and exactly 4 hours before I need to be at the studio. This better be—" Marcus stopped mid-sentence as the first image loaded on his screen. The midnight blue dress that Madison Whitmore had mocked just hours earlier filled his monitor, every detail crystal clear, every line speaking to him in the visual language that only true artists understand. "My God," he whispered, his exhaustion evaporating as he scrolled through image after image. "Who made these? And please tell me you have more." Elena smiled, knowing that she had just lit the fuse that would explode Imani's world in the most beautiful way possible. "Her name is Imani Williams. And Marcus, she's everything our industry claims to be looking for but never actually finds. She's young, she's brilliant, she's authentic, and she's being treated like invisible help by people who wouldn't recognize genius if it served them champagne." Marcus leaned closer to his screen, his designer's eye catching details that most people would miss. The hand stitching was museum quality. The fabric choices revealed an understanding of texture and movement that took decades to develop. The silhouettes were simultaneously classic and revolutionary, the kind of designs that defined eras rather than following trends. "Elena, these sketches are more sophisticated than anything I've seen from design school graduates with 4-year degrees. How is this possible? Where did she train?" "That's the most beautiful part, Marcus. She's completely self-taught. Her mother was a seamstress, and everything you're seeing comes from raw talent, pure instinct, and the kind of artistic vision that can't be manufactured in any classroom." Elena paused, letting the weight of that revelation sink in. "And Marcus, she's creating these masterpieces while working as a maid, using fabric scraps that wealthy families throw away, sewing by candlelight in a room above a garage." The silence that followed was heavy with recognition and possibility. Marcus Robinson had built his empire by championing authentic voices in an industry that often valued marketing over artistry. And what he was seeing represented everything he believed fashion could be when it came from the heart rather than the boardroom. "There's more, isn't there?" he asked, sensing the layers of story that Elena hadn't yet revealed. "Yesterday, I watched a group of spoiled teenagers publicly mock her work, calling it trash bag couture and suggesting she model for discount stores. Marcus, they humiliated her in front of 50 people, and she took it with more grace than they've shown in their entire privileged lives." Marcus felt his jaw clench with familiar anger. He had faced similar humiliation early in his career, had been dismissed and underestimated by people who couldn't see past his skin color to recognize his talent. The fashion industry had evolved since then, but apparently not enough to prevent young black artists from being crushed by the very people who should have been celebrating them. "Send me everything you have," he said, his voice taking on the decisive tone that had made him one of the most powerful figures in global fashion. "Sketches, measurements, contact information, everything. And Elena, I want to talk to her tomorrow." "Marcus, she doesn't even know I've contacted you. She has no idea that her life is about to change. Then we're going to surprise her," Marcus replied, already mentally rearranging his schedule to accommodate what he knew would be the most important phone call he'd make all year. "But first, I want you to tell me more about this family that thinks talent is something they can mock and dismiss. Because I have a feeling they're about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating people." As Elena began to share the full story of the Whitmore family's cruelty, Marcus pulled up his calendar and started making notes. By morning, he would have cleared his entire day. By afternoon, he would make a phone call that would transform Imani Williams from an invisible maid into the most talked-about new talent in fashion. The people who had laughed at her dress had no idea that their cruelty had just caught the attention of someone with the power to make their worst nightmare come true. A world where the person they had dismissed as beneath their notice would soon be celebrated as far above their reach. The phone was about to ring, and everything was about to change. But 24 hours later, as the Whitmore family gathered for their farewell brunch with society's most influential guests, they had no idea they were about to witness the most shocking revelation in their mansion's history. The morning sun streamed through the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows as Mrs. Whitmore orchestrated what she considered her social masterpiece, a farewell brunch for Elena Marchetti that would showcase the family's sophistication to a carefully curated guest list of judges, politicians, and cultural influencers. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light like scattered diamonds, while imported flowers created an atmosphere of effortless elegance that had actually required 3 days of meticulous planning. Imani moved through the gathering with her usual invisible efficiency, serving mimosas and clearing plates, while the conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. She had barely slept, the memory of yesterday's public humiliation still fresh enough to make her cheeks burn with remembered shame. But she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through countless moments of casual cruelty, her head high, despite the whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. Madison Whitmore held court near the grand piano, still basking in the social triumph of yesterday's fashion show Mockery. She had spent the morning recounting the story to anyone who would listen, embellishing the details each time to maximize the comedic effect of putting someone in their place. Her friends giggled appropriately, feeding her ego with the kind of validation that privilege mistakes for accomplishment. But Elena Marchetti watched the proceedings with the satisfied anticipation of someone holding 4 aces in a high-stakes poker game. She had timed this moment perfectly, waiting for the guest list to reach critical mass, ensuring that the maximum number of influential witnesses would be present for what was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena announced, her voice cutting through the morning chatter with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Before I leave your beautiful city, I want to share something extraordinary that happened during my visit here." The room gradually fell silent, every face turning toward Elena with the kind of respectful attention that her reputation commanded. Mrs. Whitmore beamed with anticipation, assuming that her hospitality was about to receive public praise from one of the fashion world's most respected figures. During my stay at this lovely estate, Elena continued, her eyes finding Imani across the room, I had the extraordinary privilege of discovering one of the most talented young designers I've encountered in my 40 years in the fashion industry. A murmur of polite interest rippled through the crowd. Several guests exchanged glances, wondering which local design school had produced someone worthy of Elena Marchetti's legendary standards. This young woman's work exhibits a sophistication and artistic vision that surpasses anything I've seen from recent graduates of Parsons, Fit, or even Central St. Martin's, Elena announced, her voice building with the rhythm of a master storyteller approaching the climax. Her sketches demonstrate an understanding of fabric, form, and emotional expression that takes most designers decades to develop. Madison shifted uncomfortably, something in Elena's tone triggering an instinctive unease that she couldn't quite identify. The conversation was moving in a direction that felt dangerous, though she couldn't yet see why. Yesterday evening, Elena continued, I had the pleasure of witnessing this remarkable talent firsthand, and I'm delighted to announce that as of this morning, she has received a personal invitation from Marcus Robinson. The Marcus Robinsanto joined his New York atelier as his newest protégé. The room erupted in excited whispers. Marcus Robinson's name carried the weight of fashion royalty, and the idea that someone local had caught his attention sent waves of curiosity and envy through the assembled guests. Elena, how wonderful! Mrs. Whitmore exclaimed, already calculating how she could claim some connection to this mysterious discovery. Who is this talented young woman? Do we know her? Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut crystal. Oh yes, Victoria, you know her quite well. In fact, she's been living under your roof, serving your family with grace and dignity despite facing the kind of treatment that would have broken a lesser spirit. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of a champagne glass slipping from someone's nerveless fingers seemed to echo like a gunshot. Every eye in the room turned to follow Elena's gaze as it settled on Imani, who stood frozen beside the buffet table, her face a mask of disbelief and growing wonder. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena announced, her voice ringing with triumph and vindication, allow me to introduce you to Imani Williams, whose artistic vision and extraordinary talent have just earned her a place in one of the world's most prestigious fashion houses. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and electric. Judges who had been ignoring Imani minutes earlier now stared at her with newfound respect. Politicians who built careers on recognizing rising stars suddenly saw someone they needed to know. Cultural influencers reached for their phones, understanding that they were witnessing the birth of a story that would dominate headlines. But the most dramatic reaction came from Madison Whitmore, whose face cycled through confusion, denial, horror, and finally a pale, sickening recognition of what had just happened. The woman she had publicly mocked, whose talent she had dismissed as worthless, had just been revealed as the kind of artist that her own family would pay millions to claim connection to. That's impossible, Madison whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing excitement in the room. She's just the help. Elena's smile grew even sharper. My dear child, she was never just anything. You simply weren't sophisticated enough to recognize brilliance when it served you champagne. The queen had just been revealed, and the people who had mocked her were about to discover that the fashion world was watching. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come, because what happened next would prove that the universe has a twisted sense of justice when it comes to humbling the arrogant. As the room buzzed with excitement and disbelief, Elena wasn't finished delivering her perfectly orchestrated bombshell. She reached into her purse and withdrew her phone, her fingers moving with the precision of a conductor preparing for the symphony's crescendo. In fact, Elena announced, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "Marcus wanted to personally congratulate Imani himself. He's joining us via video call right now." The silence that followed was so profound that even the mansion's grandfather clock seemed to tick louder. Every guest understood they were about to witness something unprecedented, direct connection between their world and the rarefied atmosphere of international fashion royalty. The large-screen television that Mrs. Whitmore typically used for displaying family vacation photos suddenly flickered to life, revealing the face of Marcus Robinson in his iconic New York studio. Behind him, mannequins draped in his latest creations stood like silent witnesses to his genius, while sketches and fabric samples created a backdrop that screamed artistic authenticity. "Elena, I see you've gathered quite an audience," Marcus said, his warm smile reaching through the screen to transform the entire energy of the room. "Is the young artist who created those extraordinary designs present?" All eyes turned to Imani, who stood rooted to the spot beside the buffet table, her champagne tray forgotten in her hands, as she stared at the screen in complete disbelief. This was Marcus Robinson, designer whose work she had studied and admired from afar, whose runway shows she had watched on her phone during stolen moments of break time, whose artistic philosophy had shaped her understanding of what fashion could accomplish. "Imani Williams," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the authority and warmth that had made him a global icon, "I want you to know that your designs are among the most sophisticated and emotionally resonant pieces I've encountered in recent memory. The way you've used discarded materials to create such beauty speaks to both your artistic vision and your character." The room remained suspended in stunned silence, but Marcus wasn't finished delivering his validation. "That midnight blue dress you wore yesterday, the one with the hand-beaded details, it's a masterpiece of construction and emotional storytelling. The emerald piece Elena showed me demonstrates an understanding of fabric manipulation that I don't see from designers with decades of experience. You, young lady, are precisely the kind of authentic voice our industry desperately needs." Madison Whitmore felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. The woman she had mocked, whose work she had dismissed as trash bag couture, was receiving personal praise from one of the world's most celebrated designers. The irony was so complete, so devastatingly perfect, that several guests were already mentally composing the stories they would tell about witnessing this moment. But Marcus had saved his most significant announcement for last. "Imani, I'm formally inviting you to join my New York atelier as my newest protégé. All expenses paid, full salary, and the opportunity to work alongside some of the most talented designers in the world. We'll provide housing, materials, and most importantly, the platform your extraordinary talent deserves." The explosion of excitement that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Guests who had ignored Imani moments earlier now approached her with congratulations and business cards. Politicians suddenly saw photo opportunities. Social influencers recognized the birth of a story that would generate millions of views. But the most telling reaction came from Mrs. Whitmore, who was rapidly calculating the social implications of having dismissed someone who would now be featured in Vogue and walking red carpets. Her face had gone pale as she realized that her family's treatment of Imani would soon be examined by a fashion world that valued authenticity and despised exactly the kind of elitist behavior they had displayed. "Victoria," Elena said quietly, appearing beside Mrs. Whitmore with the satisfied smile of someone who had just executed perfect justice, "I believe you and your daughter have some profound apologies to make." Meanwhile, Madison stood frozen in horror as the full weight of her cruelty crashed down upon her. The bitter irony was too perfect to ignore. Ash had spent months desperately trying to secure an internship with any respected fashion house, sending portfolio after portfolio to designers who rejected her privileged mediocrity without a second glance. And now, the woman she had publicly humiliated was being personally recruited by the most exclusive atelier in the industry. As the celebration continued around her, Imani finally found her voice. She approached the screen where Marcus waited patiently, her dignity intact despite the emotional whirlwind surrounding her. "Mr. Robinson," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I'm deeply honored by your offer and your faith in my work. But before I accept, I want to thank the Whitmore family." She turned to face her former employers, her expression serene and forgiving. "Thank you for discarding the beautiful fabrics that became my materials. Thank you for providing the experiences that taught me humility and perseverance. And thank you for showing me exactly the kind of person I never want to become." The grace of her response silenced even Marcus Robinson, who recognized true class when he saw it. Here was someone who had transformed cruelty into fuel for greatness, who had responded to humiliation with forgiveness, who had proven that character mattered more than circumstance. As Imani accepted Marcus's offer with quiet dignity, Madison Whitmore understood that she hadn't just lost an opportunity, she had witnessed the triumph of everything she had been taught to dismiss, and the complete validation of everything she had been trained to value superficially. Justice had never looked so elegant, and revenge had never tasted so sweet. But the most beautiful transformation was yet to come, because what happened in the days that followed would prove that sometimes the greatest victories aren't about defeating your enemies, they're about rising so high that their opinions become irrelevant. 3 days later, the same marble hallways that had echoed with cruel laughter now buzzed with frantic activity as the Whitmore family scrambled to control the narrative that was rapidly spiraling beyond their influence. News of Imani's discovery had spread through social media like wildfire, with fashion bloggers, industry insiders, and social justice advocates all sharing the story of the Maid whose genius had been hiding in plain sight. The irony was exquisite and inescapable. Madison Whitmore, who had spent her entire life measuring worth by designer labels and social status, now watched helplessly as every major fashion publication celebrated someone she had dismissed as beneath her notice. Vogue featured Imani's sketches on their Instagram story. Harper's Bazaar ran an article titled, "From Servants' Quarters to Runway Dreams: The Imani Williams Story." Even international outlets picked up the narrative, framing it as a distinctly American tale of talent, triumphing over privilege and prejudice. But perhaps the most devastating blow to the family's carefully constructed image came when Marcus Robinson himself went public with the story during a live interview on a morning fashion show. With millions watching, he held up photographs of Imani's designs while describing his shock at discovering such extraordinary talent in someone who had been treated as invisible by the very people who should have been celebrating her. "What struck me most," Marcus told the interviewer, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience, "wasn't just the sophistication of her work, but the grace with which she handled years of being underestimated and, frankly, mistreated. This young woman took fabric scraps that others threw away and transformed them into art. She took cruelty and transformed it into fuel for greatness. That's not just talent, that's character." Meanwhile, Imani stood in her small room, packing the few belongings that would make the journey to New York with her. The contrast was striking. She who had been treated as disposable was now the center of a story that the entire fashion world wanted to claim, while the family who had dismissed her scrambled to distance themselves from their own behavior. Elena Marchetti had orchestrated one final moment of poetic justice. She arranged for a photographer from a major fashion magazine to capture Imani's departure, creating images that would become iconic in fashion history. The photographs showed Imani walking through the mansion's grand entrance, not as a servant leaving through the back door, but as an artist making her triumphant exit through the front, her head held high and her future blazing bright before her. Mrs. Whitmore attempted one last desperate move to salvage her reputation, approaching Imani with what she clearly believed was a generous offer. "Imani, dear, perhaps we could arrange for you to continue living here while you pursue your hobby. We could even convert the garage into a proper studio space." Think of the publicity the Whitmore family, supporting emerging talent, The audacity was breathtaking. The same woman who had allowed her daughter to publicly humiliate Imani now wanted to claim credit for her success, to transform cruelty into patronage with a simple rewrite of history. Imani's response was a masterclass in dignified rejection. "Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate the offer, but my dreams were never a hobby. They were always my destiny. I just needed the right people to see them." She paused, letting the words settle like dust after an earthquake. "I'll be fine in New York, surrounded by people who recognize talent when they see it, regardless of the uniform it's wearing." Madison, who had remained largely silent since the revelation, finally found her voice for one last desperate attempt at damage control. "Imani, I hope you know that when I made those comments, I didn't mean anything personal. It was just joking around." The explanation hung in the air like a deflated balloon, fooling no one. Imani turned to face the girl who had tried to crush her spirit, and for a moment, the room held its breath. "Madison," Imani said quietly, "cruelty is never just joking around. When you mock someone's dreams, when you try to make them feel small, when you use your privilege as a weapon against someone who can't fight back, that's not humor. That's revealing who you really are inside." She paused, her voice remaining gentle despite the power of her words. "I hope someday you learn that true class isn't about what you can afford to buy, it's about how you treat people who can't do anything for you." As Imani walked toward the door, carrying her single suitcase and the portfolio that would soon grace the walls of Marcus Robinson's atelier, she represented something that the Whitmore family had never encountered before, someone who had transcended their judgment entirely. They could no longer hurt her because she was moving into a world where their opinions held no weight, where talent mattered more than pedigree, where character counted more than connections. The final image was perfect in its symbolism. Imani stepping into the car that would take her to the airport, to New York, to a future brighter than anything the mansion's crystal chandeliers could illuminate. Behind her, the Whitmore family stood in the doorway of their beautiful prison, watching someone they had deemed inferior rise to heights they would never reach. 6 months later, Imani Williams walked the runway at New York Fashion Week, wearing a creation that had started as scraps in a mansion's garbage bin and evolved into a dress that stopped traffic in Times Square. The fashion world proclaimed her a visionary, a voice of authentic artistry in an industry too often dominated by manufactured celebrity. Marcus Robinson stood backstage, watching his protégé receive a standing ovation from an audience that included editors, celebrities, and industry leaders from around the world. "You know what I love most about this moment?" he told Elena Marchetti, who had flown in specifically to witness Imani's triumph. "Those people who tried to destroy her spirit are probably watching this on television right now, finally understanding what real talent looks like." Meanwhile, back in the mansion where it all began, Madison Whitmore stared at her laptop screen, watching the live stream of the fashion show where the woman she had mocked was being celebrated as the industry's newest star. The dress that had begun with her family's discarded fabric was now being called a masterpiece by critics who would never know her name. The lesson was complete, the transformation total. They had laughed at her because they only saw her job, but the world had seen her talent, and that had changed everything, not just for Imani, but for everyone who witnessed the power of recognizing genius wherever it chooses to reveal itself. Never underestimate quiet brilliance. Share this story if you believe talent deserves recognition regardless of where it comes from, because somewhere in your world, there's an Imani Williams waiting for someone to see past the uniform to the extraordinary person underneath. The question isn't whether genius exists among use-its, whether we're wise enough to recognize it when it's serving us champagne. That runway triumph wasn't just a fashion moment hit, was a masterclass in how the universe corrects injustice when we least expect it. As someone who has spent years documenting stories of hidden brilliance, I can tell you that Imani Williams represents something profoundly beautiful about the human spirit, the ability to transform pain into purpose, scraps into masterpieces, and dismissal into destiny. Here's what the Whitmore family learned too late, and what we all must remember: genius doesn't announce itself with designer labels or prestigious addresses. It often arrives quietly, wearing work clothes, speaking softly, creating beauty in shadows while others chase spotlights. Madison Whitmore spent her privileged life believing that worth could be purchased, that talent came with pedigree, that superiority was something you inherited rather than earned. She was wrong about everything. The psychological truth that emerges cuts deeper than fashion. When we diminish others based on their circumstances, we're not revealing their limitations, we're exposing our own insecurity, our desperate need to feel superior, our terror of discovering that excellence might exist in places we never thought to look. Imani's grace under pressure revealed more about character than any designer gown ever could. But here's what moves me most about this story. Imani could have used her platform for revenge, could have publicly destroyed the family that tormented her, could have turned her triumph into their humiliation. Instead, she chose transformation over destruction, forgiveness over fury, elevation over elimination. She proved that true strength isn't about crushing those who underestimate you. It's about rising so high that their opinions become irrelevant. The fashion world didn't just gain a talented designer that day, it gained a reminder that authenticity always defeats artifice, that character matters more than connections, that the most dangerous people aren't those who boast about their power, but those who carry greatness in silence while serving others with dignity. Imani's story teaches us that every person we encounter might be carrying dreams that could change the world, talents that could reshape industries, stories that could inspire millions. The janitor might be an artist. The cashier might be a poet. The security guard might be a philosopher. Our assumptions about worth based on job titles aren't just wrong, they're spiritually toxic. If this story reminded you to look beyond uniforms to see the extraordinary people underneath, if it challenged your assumptions about where talent comes from, if it inspired you to treat everyone with the respect they deserve regardless of their role in your life, then Imani's journey meant something. Hit that like button if you believe in recognizing hidden brilliance. Share your own story of unexpected talent in the comments below. And subscribe to this channel, because stories like this, stories that celebrate the overlooked, challenge the privileged, and prove that character always triumphs over circumstance, are exactly what our world needs to see. Don't let this message of hope and justice stop with you.